Welcome to the Teacher Fellows podcast. My name is Ryan Rarick. I am an education pathway teacher and instructional coach in Washington County School District. As always, I am joined by my colleague, friend, and the 2020 Utah Teacher of the Year, Lauren Merkley. Lauren, how's it going?
Pretty good. I'm enjoying the arrival of spring or summer.
Yes, it's fantastic. We're going to jump right into it. We're excited for our guest today, but before Lauren introduces our guest, I'm going to talk a little bit about our topic for today. Leadership is one of the biggest challenges when it comes to sustaining innovation in schools. Today, we're going to discuss a framework created with that challenge in mind. We're going to focus our conversation on the portrait of a leader, what it is, why it matters, and how it has the potential to empower transformational leaders across education. Our conversation will cover the key elements of the portrait, how educators can use it for professional growth and systemic change, and how it builds on the momentum of local and state portraits of graduates. Now that we've got the topic down, Lauren, go ahead and introduce us to our fabulous guest today.
We're very lucky to have Sid Young with us today. So Sid Young is a passionate educator and a systems thinker who's helping transform how schools approach teaching and learning. She is not a member of the Fellows, but she's a friend of the Fellows as Director of Teaching and Learning at KnowledgeWorks. So there she works with educators in building leadership capacity, very connected to the Fellows, that's needed to scale personalized competency-based learning, putting students at the center and turning visionary ideas into everyday practice. She has a science background, a knack for drawing insightful parallels, and brings both curiosity and clarity to the work of leading meaningful learner-driven change. So Sid, thank you so much for making some time to talk with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I'm thinking maybe as a little bit of table setting. So normally we've had mostly classroom educators, teachers that are leading from the classroom on the podcast. And you work for KnowledgeWorks. And to sort of, again, set the table, could you tell us in like a sentence what KnowledgeWorks does? What is that organization about?
Yeah, so KnowledgeWorks is a national nonprofit based out of Cincinnati, Ohio. And our mission really is to help schools and districts and states transition to teaching and learning to be personalized and competency-based.
She did it, folks. She did it in one sentence. That was very impressive and very good. Normally you say one sentence to someone on a podcast and it's 5 minutes. So outstanding. Thank you for helping us. I know Ryan wants to dive in and really get into the meat of what we're going to talk about today.
I'm sure that the conversation about KnowledgeWorks, we'll learn more about it as we go. But Sid, just to get us into it, tell us about the portrait of a leader. What is it and why does it matter?
Yeah, great question. Just as a portrait of a graduate or a portrait of a learner defines what students need to be able to thrive now and into the future, a portrait of a leader ensures we're equipping educators with the attributes, the mindsets, the skills to be able to sustain and scale learner-centered systems change, such as personalized competency-based learning. It defines the 5 attributes necessary for educators, regardless of level of leadership, to effectively and sustainably lead this type of change through personalized competency-based learning. So it was built to really support those navigating some of today's most complex education challenges, especially post-COVID. The voice of educators is at the heart of this work and the heart of creating the portrait of a leader. And we wanted to really make sure that it reflects and aligns with the realities of today's classrooms and school communities. And when we say leadership, portrait of a leader, we're not just talking about administrative roles, but teacher leaders like the fellows. So teacher leaders, instructional coaches, department chairs, even school board leaders, all of those people play a vital role in shaping education and supporting learners. So when we say leadership, we're really using that broad.
I love that. I don't know if it's a misnomer or just a pattern that we've fallen into, that a lot of times when teachers think of leaders, they think of their supervisors, their principals, their assistant principals, their district coordinators and things like that. But what you're saying here is with the portrait of a leader, it's, as you stated, it's a broader term that includes teachers that remain in the classroom, that lead from within. And you also mentioned that it's centered around the concept of personalized competency-based learning, or the acronym, because we love acronyms in education, PCBL. Maybe some of our listeners who maybe haven't heard of that or aren't familiar with that, can you give us a quick overview of what PCBL is and how the Portrait of a Leader helps with that?
Yeah, so personalized competency-based learning, or PCBL, is a set of practices, really a mindset and way of being that flips teaching and learning roles, giving students more agency and helping them really make choices about their learning, how they will learn, how they'll demonstrate that learning, tying it and connecting it to their interests and passions, and making it more relevant to them, but also having it be competency-based, where it's not about bringing Kleenexes or expo markers for extra credit, right? Focused on learners and learning, and not chasing points or chasing a specific grade, but really making sure that students master and are proficient in and can demonstrate proficiency of the skills and knowledge that they need to move on to the next levels of learning. The Portrait of a Leader, with that lens, is very collaborative. There are 5 distinct attributes for a leader in a personalized competency-based learning system or classroom that really drive at that collaborative, human-centered approach where students and learning are the center of the system.
We're going to link to the portrait of, I keep wanting to say portrait of a graduate. I've been well trained by Utah. Portrait of a leader in the show notes. Hope people will visit and pull that up. But could you, for people who don't have it in front of them, you mentioned the 5 key qualities. Can you give us a quick rundown of what those qualities are?
Absolutely. And with each one of these 5 leadership attributes, there are also reflection prompts for self-reflection and examples of application for each one through different levels of leadership from the classroom and elsewhere. The 5 attributes are human-centered. Human-centered leaders prioritize people and relationships. Transformational is the second, and transformational leaders drive sustainable, forward-looking change. Authentic is the third. We have human-centered, transformational, and authentic. Authentic leaders lead with credibility and vulnerability, which if you pause, you think about that. I've been in education roles where I've had that kind of a leader and where I haven't, and authenticity wins for me every time. The 4th is collaborative. Collaborative leaders foster shared goals and actions, do the work rather than to their teams. The last one, the 5th, is advocate. Leaders who advocate, champion equitable structures, not just for learners, but also for their colleagues and other educators. But above all else, I would say educators leading change must be human-centered and transformational. Those 2 out of the 5 really are foundational. Without a human-centered focus, all of the other leadership attributes become disingenuous. And without a transformational approach, all other leadership attributes would be in service of a very traditional system, which is what we're trying to shift away from.
That's very resonant on this podcast because Ryan and I, and in one episode we did talk about this because we're friends in real life. So much of what we talk about on the podcast is actually about human nature and is actually about how teachers are interacting with the human students they're working with, the human colleagues they have, the humans in their community. So I love that this format really prioritizes that as absolutely necessary to the work of meaningful change. I encourage everyone to go to the website and look at, because the visual is actually quite helpful and you can see beneath each attribute, there's detail on each one. So can you take us from this portrait, which is visionary and abstract, right? It's talking about qualities and attributes of a leader. Can you take us into the concrete now and talk about how educators or districts are concretizing or using this? Because it risks, right, being a lofty thing. And I know that the work you're doing is really trying to bring it into the reality of teachers and leaders. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Real quick, Sid, I want to jump in and say I just want to give Lauren a shout out for working in the word concretizing into the podcast. So that's a gold star.
Thank you.
And
I think our bingo players at home will be really happy with that.
That's fantastic. Yeah, so I would say just like when you're rolling out a portrait of a graduate, that's aspirational, right? You want it to be the promise of a diploma. Those traits or skills or competencies are developed over time. You don't just develop the traits in a portrait of a graduate during high school, right? From the earliest years on, there's a natural progression of how you would develop any of the attributes in a portrait. The leader is very much the same, aspirational yet attainable. but it's not developed overnight, right? So I think the best way of phrasing it are there three distinct ways that educators can use this resource, this portrait of a leader. And one is for their own professional development to support their leadership growth through some structured self-reflection. That's what the prompts are for, the reflective prompts, and actionable steps. They'll be creating progressions, how these leadership attributes are developed. And they're going to be doing that with educators from across the nation. And so that it'll show this natural pathway, and you can identify where you are and maybe a next step for each of those attributes. The second I would say is creating common language for leadership development, shared language and being transparent about what those things mean. That really matters when you're working together to be in a continual improvement cycle. So being able to articulate and use shared language around what leadership is and have a framework for being able to talk about it and make goals and progress and hold each other accountable, I think it's really helpful. And the third, I think, is it comes down to inspiration for innovation, encouraging educators to reimagine what leadership can look like, especially in ways that foster student agency and engagement and long-term success. So as the relationships and roles of educators and students shift, as you're becoming more student-centered and shifting towards personalized competency-based learning, having these attributes articulated and having a common way of talking about them can really help build some coherence through all levels of the system. I think Utah has been such a leader nationally when it comes to reimagining education. And this portrait of a leader, I think, can extend that leadership that already exists in ensuring that educators are equipped to build and sustain capacity for transforming teaching and learning with personalized competency-based learning. So if you have this portrait of a graduate that articulates the knowledge and skills and dispositions that you want for Utah graduates, for example, as the state has put out, then it makes sense to have a portrait of a leader that articulates what the leaders need to be able to know and do to support their learners with achieving the portrait of a graduate.
One of my favorite things about what you just explained, and this is a thought that came early when I looked at this framework, but even when you first started explaining it, you compared the portrait of a leader to the portrait of a graduate, where the portrait of a graduate are the competencies that the students need, and the portrait of a leader are the competencies that the teacher leaders need. What's super fascinating to me is when you were going through the different aspects, is there some components in here like self-assessment, like where am I, what are my next steps? And you mentioned like common language, so that's like vocabulary development. And then we've got this framework, which to me is like a model of proficiency. This is what success looks like. And then you've got inspiration for innovation, which is the willingness to take some strategic risks, to try new things and to do new things. It's so fascinating to me that parallels between what it takes for teachers to become effective leaders and what we want from our students to become effective learners. We literally want all of those same steps. We want them to self-assess. Personalized competency-based learning is where am I? Where do I need to be? What are the steps that will get me from point A to point B? The vocabulary, like what do I need to learn to operate within this paradigm? What does success look like? I'm just pontificating on how much I like this, but I was wondering if you could speak to that about maybe the parallels between what we want for teachers and what we want for students. This goes back to being human-centered. In teaching, we often talk about being student-centered. It's sometimes lost on teachers that we also need to model the very behaviors that we're expecting from the students. I think this framework helps us accomplish that. So that was a big setup for a question, but I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so anyone who's been in the portrait of a graduate or portrait of a learner movement, I think the portrait is an opportunity to really deepen your impact and not just focus on what students need to know and become to thrive after graduation and during their K-12 education. But it's really about ensuring that every leader at every level has the skills to make real lasting change in their schools and districts. And leaders who develop the attributes in this portrait of a learner are more likely to create the conditions and build capacity for learners to realize the aspirations in a portrait of a graduate. I think it's like parallel tracks that are aligned where you want to create conditions and learning experiences for students to develop not only academic knowledge, but also these skills that will get them through the challenges that come with a rapidly changing future. Same with leaders, to really stand the test of time and all of the change that is afoot and a lot of uncertainty in a lot of cases with the education profession, and making sure that we're focusing and measuring the right things for young people. This broader view of success that comes with the portrait of a graduate. I think the portrait of a leader, I imagine if I was a new teacher, you have the portrait of a first-year teacher in Utah. If I was a first-year teacher aspiring to spend my first year teaching with some of those attributes in place, I would want to be supported by a leader, prioritize people and relationships, that was human-centered, that was transformational, who could drive sustainable, forward-looking change, that was authentic, especially when you're talking about people. Authenticity, leading with credibility, vulnerability, making my own learning and goals as a leader in developing these same attributes transparent to my team. Collaborative, fostering shared goals, which could be the goals in the portrait of a learner for our young people, and advocating for equitable structures that make all of that happen. Not only for myself, but my colleagues, my team, the school community at large, and especially for young people. I think there's a lot of ways that the two can support each other as you're looking at creating learning experiences and a learning environment that supports young people with developing these skills over time. Also making sure that the educators in your community, on your team, within your building, within your district, have opportunities to reflect and prioritize what they want to work on and be supported with the experiences to develop those traits. I think that's really important. And once you experience that as an adult in the system, it makes you more excited and makes you really truly think about what's possible to provide for our kids, to be able to develop and build the skills they need to pursue whatever future they prefer after graduation.
I love that. I'm going to give a shout out real quick. I mentioned in the intro, like one of my roles is an education pathway teacher. So I teach students who want to become teachers. And you mentioned the portrait of a first-year teacher. And that's been like a huge component of what I teach in those classes is we break that down, and the students really seem to enjoy it because it clarifies what they need to develop. They're like sophomores in high school. You mentioned this earlier, that it's not something that you attain instantaneously. It's something that develops over time. And then with what you were just talking about there at the end of your comment about as people experience this, it builds their capacity, but also like their efficacy and their confidence to be successful in the future. But I want to give Lauren a chance to take us. Where do you want to go next, Lauren?
I really want to give Sid a moment to highlight some interesting opportunities for teachers to get involved. So if there are listeners that are hearing this and saying how I could develop my capacity as a leader, how I could connect with other teachers who are similarly dedicated to PCB LMNOP or whatever the alphabet soup is. Just kidding. It's personalized competency-based learning. I know what it stands for. But if there's people out there thinking, I want to get involved or I want to broaden my skills or my scope, maybe Sid could tell us a little bit about the couple network opportunities there are for teachers.
Absolutely. KnowledgeWorks has a national network. It's an online network that includes educators from all over the country. And in some cases, even globally, people have started to join. It's a free national network that any educator can join and benefit from. So that's called Lead for Learners. There are different events and meetups that are virtual. Sometimes there's a topic and a handful of people from a learning community will get on and share what they're doing around the practices of personalized competency-based learning. Sometimes it's more at the systems level, and a lot of times it's at the classroom practice level, and different ways they're leading out in their communities with what they're trying out and scaling. But then there's also, because this portrait of a learner framework is new, we are starting an emerging leaders cohort. There will be 2 opportunities this year. One starts in June and the other starts in December. It's a 12-month cohort of, we like to say, emerging leaders. Think of building your leadership bench. But leaders from all different levels of the system can join that. There's even an in-person convening experience and leadership lab of sorts for each cohort. So you can find more information if you look for leadforlearners.org/events. We also have different webinars and panelists and a really thriving online community where you can post a question and people from all over will answer and share freely. If you have a question or problem of practice implementing personalized competency-based learning, that's a great place to go and get some ideas. Also share what you're working on.
Okay, so Lead for Learners Network and the Emerging Leaders Cohort are the two opportunities, just to summarize. Perfect. We will link those in the show notes as well.
To all of our listeners, please look at those show notes. We'll have resources there, including the Portrait of a Leader document, the PDF that's in there, and then links to these growth opportunities. Lauren, and for Sid, thank you so much. Time speeds through on this. As we say on a lot of our episodes, we feel like there's so much more meat on the bone to talk about, but we're going to transition into our conclusion right now. Lauren, as you listened to Sid today, what were some of your top takeaways?
I have a lot written down. I would just say I'm imagining a teacher who loves to teach, but doesn't want to leave the classroom to become an admin or an instructional coach or whatever it is. They love their classroom situation. And it's hard a lot of times for those teachers to find a way forward. The sort of traditional ladder climbing of sort of a corporate world doesn't translate into education, right? It's relatively flat. There are very few formal leaders in a school. I mean, I think the Utah Teacher Fellows fills a similar hole, but this is such a cool reflective tool that anybody could go on. And we encourage you all to pull up the Portrait of a Leader. I actually read a bunch of the prompts for the different qualities. And I thought, oh my gosh, if you are, I don't know, say you're a fifth year teacher, most of your responsibilities are just in your classroom, and you're looking for a way to level up, even just starting with the reflection questions starts to get a teacher thinking about what opportunities they might be able to pursue in their school or volunteer for or raise their hand for. Oh man, there's not a big deposit in my advocate bank, right? Like through these reflection questions and the prompts, I think it just can get people thinking differently, teachers thinking differently about their role and about what opportunities to pursue. I think this is a super useful tool for teachers looking for a way to broaden the scope without leaving the classroom full time and even building their skills.
Yeah, I love that. My big takeaway, I mentioned some of my takeaways when I was explaining them in my question setups, but one of the big ones is something that permeated this, and Sid mentioned it a couple of times, which it's basically imagining school differently instead of the traditional model. That ties into personalized competency-based learning. It ties into what do our students need to be successful in the future? What do our teachers need to be successful in the future? And just a thought that kept coming to me is that school can and most likely will look very different in the future. That's not a scary thing. That's an exciting thing. The reason that it'll look different is because of the work like this, where we're analyzing where we are, where we want to be, and figuring out how to get there. I wrote down a couple of words. Sid mentioned the Portrait of a Leader is both aspirational and attainable. First of all, I love alliteration. But secondly, it's kind of the perfect sweet spot for where you want a goal to be, right? It's got to be challenging so that it pushes you, but it's got to be within your grasp. And then as soon as you reach out and grab it, there's going to be a new goal that's aspirational and attainable a little farther out. So that was one of my big takeaways. And then something I always fall back on is when we were talking about what this might look like when we look at competency-based learning as students are making choices to direct their learning. I just thought from just a simplistic standpoint, this would solve the point-chasing fiasco that grades often turn into, where kids want to know how many points they need. Instead of asking that question, it's like, what do I need to demonstrate? What do I need to attain? What skill do I need in order to move to the next level? It's not just to get a diploma and pass, but it's to know more, to do more, to be more effective at whatever our interests are and wherever pursuits we embark on. So those are a couple of my takeaways. All right, that's it for the podcast today. Thank you again to Sid for joining us. And for all of our listeners, please continue to listen and spread the word to others as well. You can subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Google Play, Apple Music, Stitcher, or any other podcast platform. Check us out on Instagram for our breakout videos. Once again, everybody go look at the show notes to this episode for a plethora of resources about the items we discussed in this episode and some professional learning opportunities. We produce episodes every month. This podcast was produced by the wonderful Kayla Towner. For my co-host, Lauren Merkley, this is Ryan Rarick. Go make teaching great, everybody. See ya.